This will relate to your Unit 1 assignment for work, which you'll find out more about next week. And I'm not going to give you any more introduction than that.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. This is sort of a different talk for me. So some of you may have recognized me. I walk through these halls every once in a while, a couple times a year, talking to the physics students, primarily on careers in physics, careers in astrophysics. This is a break from my normal talk here at White. And in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broad topic of science communication. And when someone talks about science communication, it can mean different things to different people. It depends on whether I'm talking to a professional audience or whether I'm talking, say, someone from the public. So it really does depend. When you hear that term, science communication, really you have to think about what vantage point you're talking about. Are you talking about it from the perspective of someone like me who, I guess first and foremost, is a scientist rather than a communicator, if you like, or someone whose job, say, like Brian Cox or someone like that, whose primary job now is more on the communication side. So we all do science communication, but our audience will vary a little bit depending on whether we're wearing that professional scientist hat or whether we're wearing the public outreach or engagement hat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about science communication from both directions, both from a professional standpoint and from a sort of public outreach and engagement standpoint. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean when we say science communication and engagement, how we go about doing it, where we actually conduct this communication, and probably the most important thing is why do we actually do it. I mean, if you could go back to ancient Greek times, and go back thousands of years, and science was done differently. I mean, if you were a scientist, you might have a patron who just paid you to do research, and you investigated whatever it was that interested you, but it predated the era of competitive grants, applying for funding to do something, public engagement, popular magazines, obviously social media as a whole. It was a different era back then where communication was, in some sense, less important other than maybe to your peers. And that peer-to-peer communication is still a big part of what we do, but a much larger part of what we do now is communicating with you guys, with the general public as a whole. And when I come to the end of the talk and talk about why that is important, hopefully, if nothing else, that's what you'll walk away with, at least some appreciation for why a greater effort is going into the communication side of things. Okay, so I'm going to combine what and where when I talk about science communication into a few slides here, because it's difficult to separate when I say what is science communication and where do we do it. They are sort of intertwined. And so again, it comes back to, say, professional versus public. So just a few numbers for some context. Most of our research that we do gets published in scientific journals. So across every endeavor, from medicine to geoscience to my area of astrophysics, there are something on the order of, these numbers, they're not hard and fast, but they're rough numbers, roughly about 40,000 scientific journals published around the world nowadays. And roughly about 4 million papers per year are published across all disciplines of science. And I tried to figure out exactly how many professional scientists there are in the world. The number is very difficult to pin down, but it's on the order of 10 million, maybe 20 million, that sort of number of scientists, professional scientists. And so for contrast, if we talk about popularizing science, there are roughly about 100 popular science magazines, so you'll know some of them. If you're into astronomy, it might be Sky at Night or Sky and Telescope. New Scientist is one of the biggest ones within the UK, Scientific American in the North American market, Australasian Science in the Australian market. But every country has a certain number of popular science magazines, and there's roughly about 100 of them published around the world annually. And there's, again, rough number, something like about 4,000 professional science writers that contribute and underpin the efforts of these magazines. Now, the number, again, is very difficult to pin down because there are a lot of people who multitask. They may do a bit of science writing part of the day for a newspaper, but then they may be contributing something in business or politics the other part of the time. But it's that sort of number for context. Now, the ability to reach a larger number of people is pretty clear. I mean, the number of people who read New Scientist, Nature, Sky and Telescope. It's a very, very large number. Probably when you take all of those popular science magazines and look across the world as a whole, you're sort of reaching an audience on the order of 1 billion people when you cross all of the different popular science magazines across every country in the world. So you are impacting a larger number of people than we do with our specialist scientific journals. So that's just some context. Our primary way as professional scientists to communicate our result professionally is through these journals. These professional journals use a refereeing process. So it's not as simple as, say, me writing up a paper and publishing it. I could write up a paper and sort of publish it on a blog or something, but there's no internal vetting of the science, if you like. We use a referee process, and it will vary from discipline to discipline. Within my field in astrophysics, there's maybe a half dozen major journals. We write up a paper, we submit it, a scientific editor looks it over and assigns 1 or 2 referees, peers in the field that the paper will be sent to. Those people will look it over, they will pick through it, they will look for the things that they need to or they want to see changed before the paper is accepted for publication. And it typically takes maybe on the order of 4 or 5 months from the point of submitting your paper and having 1 or 2 iterations with a referee before the paper gets accepted for publication. As you move from discipline to discipline, how this is done, how these scientific results are communicated are done a little bit differently. In our field, in astrophysics, all of the journals have more or less the same prestige factor, what we call impact factor. And the success rate for publication is probably 70%, something like that. 2/3, 3/4 of the papers that we submit get published. And we don't have a strong preference across these different journals. They're all more or less the same. In other disciplines like medicine, biology, a lot of the lab-based physics research, there's more of a hierarchy in place. And so the way that they submit papers, they make a self-assessment. Do they think this paper is one of the top 10% in the field? Then in which case they may aim at the highest impact journal and submit there. The success rate for publishing in those high impact journals might be 10% or 15%. So if your peers agree with it, it'll get published in that high impact journal. If not, it gets rejected, and typically you will go down to the next one in the list and the next one on the list, and eventually it sifts and finds its right place in terms of its impact. But that's different than our field, like I said, where everything is more or less flat and every journal is the same. The success rate of publishing papers in, say, biology and geosciences and other areas of physics is roughly the same. 2/3 of the papers get published. It's just, in our field, it's a flat distribution of impact, whereas in these other fields, you have to go through this process of finding where your paper sits in the hierarchy of impact. There is kind of if I think back to when I started my PhD, which is 35 years ago, something like that, the philosophy at that point in time was do excellent research, publish the paper. As time has progressed, the philosophy is there's still a push to publish excellence, but there's a mantra that is now spread across through all the science, which is publish or perish. And so there is a lot of pressure to get papers out as quickly as you can. I think that probably impacts a little bit on the quality of the paper as you're rushing to beat your competitors to get your paper out first. There's also a belief that you need to, in some sense, quantity over quality. Having published 10 papers in a year in sort of a middling journal can be seen as make you more marketable, let's say, in the job market than publishing 1 or 2 papers in a high impact journal. So it's that's kind of a sweeping generalization, but it is a reality now of the scientific publishing community that the number of papers per person has escalated over the last 10, 20 years, and is driven by, again, this belief that you must publish or you will perish. The competition is that high and that fierce that getting more papers out at the expense to some degree of the quality of the papers has started to take over. Okay, so that's sort of the publishing side of things. And again, subtle differences from field to field, but that gives you a flavor for how things work. Typically, I guess I didn't really say, Depends on the discipline. In my field, you publish maybe 4, 5, 6 papers per year. If you're part of a large team that has 30, 40, 50 people, say particle physics, you might have 100 or 200 co-authors. Obviously, you have more people, that means more papers can be written, so you might publish more papers if you're part of a large team than if you're part of a small team. But those sorts of numbers, a half dozen papers per year, is kind of the expectation in broadly across science. It'll be different in medical research than it will be in astrophysics, but that just gives you some ballpark numbers. So that's the primary way we disseminate information to our peers. If I go back in time 30 years ago, the way that you would kind of advertise that work was through conferences. Across all of science, again, this is very difficult to pin down, but there's something on the order of 1 million conferences around the world dedicated to science. That can be small little workshops of a handful of people up to very large ones with 10,000 participants, with a mixture of lectures and presentations and poster presentations. This was the dominant way that we would, in the pre-internet era, this is how you advertised your work beyond just sort of publishing it inside of a paper. Now the advent of social media has sort of changed that. It's kind of reduced the impact of conferences in most disciplines. They're still important. The media still picks up on the big ones. BBC will show up at, we hosted the National Astronomy meeting in Hull last year. That's a big thing in our particular field, and so you get the BBC and Nature and New Scientist sending their reporters to stay for the week. But for the most part, things are picked up now through either the wire service or through various social media platforms. And so I just did a quick little thing last night, looked at a number of scientists, a number of, say, public outreach scientists, if you like, and compared the number of Twitter followers that they had, for example, compared with, say, athletes, just to give you a feel for sort of the reach of some of these scientists and how they communicate. So if you just, this line through here is a number of famous, you'll recognize probably Brian Cox's name, who's approaching 3 million followers on Twitter. If you like the equivalent in the US, or if you watch Big Bang Theory, you would have seen Bill Nye the Science Guy, or Neil deGrasse Tyson. These are the two science outreach personalities who have the largest footprint in Twitter land and the Twitter sphere. And so you can see sort of Neil's numbers, that 11 million or so, are comparable to sort of the Twitter followers that you would have for some of the bigger footballers in the UK. So Sergio Aguero is around 12, 13 million. I think I looked up Wayne Rooney, he's around 15 million. There are always exceptions, of course. Look at someone like Cristiano Ronaldo, who's got like 70 million followers. There are these exceptions, or Katy Perry's got 150 million, something like that. But the most followed outreach scientists have comparable numbers to sort of the athletes that you might know, Lewis Hamilton, Anthony Joshua, these sorts of ones. Famous astronauts, Chris Hadfield, Canadian astronaut, I think he's the most followed astronaut on Twitter, and Tim Peake, who hopefully will be here for the British Science Festival that I'll say something about shortly, is approaching 2 million. So again, the impact of these outreach scientists is comparable to some of the celebrities that you might encounter or you may be following yourselves. It is interesting, and it's just a reflection of reality. If you look at the number of Twitter followers that active research scientists have, someone like me, just as an example, or anyone else who you would consider whose primary job is research rather than the outreach and engagement side of things, typically about a factor of 1,000 smaller than those sorts of numbers. So the people doing the research typically have, at best, a few thousand followers. The people who report the research to the wider community, the Brian Cox's, the Bill Nye, the Neil deGrasse Tyson, that's where the impact in terms of reaching you guys is felt much more than anything that I do in a direct sense. And again, you can look at the number of followers that Scientific American and New Scientist and Nature and Science have. Again, way, way higher, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times higher than any individual research active scientist. So in terms of reaching people, this is how we reach the majority of people. There's another way, another important part, beyond just talking to our peers and talking to the public and outreach, is political discourse. So we have to, a very important part of what we do is communicating our results back to government. So in terms of setting the agenda for things like stem cell research, genome research, the investment in things like European Space Agency, space mining, all of these things are things that we're responsible for feeding back to government through various committees. And even it does get into the realm of politics, non-scientific politics in some sense. Things like little facts like roughly half of the researchers in the country come from outside of the UK. It's a mixture. So it comes into Brexit-related things and immigration issues. If I'm not saying the UK is the same as the approach maybe that Donald Trump might be taking in the US in terms of an isolationist mantra. But it's important to think about what that would actually mean if you really did embrace that sort of philosophy. It impacts at the level of half of the researchers in this country come from outside the UK. So these are the little things that are important for us to at least get that message home to government as these sorts of negotiations are going on right now. Who are the people who do these things? I covered the what, the where, and I've just got a few minutes where I'll cover some of these other questions about how and who. There are, like I say, there are people like me, scientists who kind of do outreach and engagement to some extent as a supplement to the day job, which is primarily research and teaching at the uni. There are people who are 100% dedicated outreach personnel, like Sheila Kanani at the Royal Astronomical Society. There are people who you would call media people associated with science and outreach. So this is Elise Andrew, the creator of, I guess, one of the more popular scientific blogs. Some of you might know IFL Science, which stands for I Fucking Love Science. It is one of the most popular blogs, and it reaches a huge audience. And if you don't follow it, I would highly recommend it. And then there are sort of the hybrid approach, people who are scientists and have a day job. Brian Cox has his day job both in media but also at Manchester Uni. But they can demand sort of speaker fees at a level that other people cannot demand. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. These are all different types of ways of communicating science, either professionally or through the public. But just to give you a flavor for sort of the spectrum that comes under science communication. How you actually do science communication? You can do it in a formal sense. You can do a degree. So we've started an MSc in science communication at the university. There are comparable degrees elsewhere across the UK and around the world. So one can go through the formal training process and learn in a way that I could never be able to teach you, because I'm sort of making this up on the fly rather than going through a proper degree program. So that's one way you can get involved. The other way, the way that I got involved is purely just through putting yourself out and practicing. Up till 3 years ago, which is when I moved to Hull and we established the Milne Center for Astrophysics, I'd done almost no public outreach and engagement. I had not interacted with colleges and schools. I've had to change the way I think now that I'm here and I'm responsible for recruitment into physics and in some sense the STEM subjects as a whole. And so that has led me to basically just embracing it wholeheartedly. It's why I work quite closely with Sarah and Rob and Stuart on coming up with research and internship opportunities at the university. And I do some on the order, I guess on average, one per week. So yesterday I was out at Withersea High School giving a careers in physics talk. And during the peak time, I may be doing that 2 or 3 times a week. There was no short way for me to learn it. I just threw myself in because I had to do it as part of my recruitment responsibilities at the university. And so I've come to actually love it and embrace it, but I've learned on the fly rather than going through any formal training. The other way you can do it is through volunteering. You don't have to be a professional scientist to do this sort of thing. There's many ways people can help through the British Science Association, who have a meeting tonight at the Old Grey Mare. There's a new branch at Hull now. There are companies like Lab Rascals who go out into schools that people get involved with. And there are also paid science communicators. This is a thorny issue for some of us. Certain astronauts charge £50,000 to do a 1-hour speaking engagement in the evening. Some scientists charge comparable numbers like that. So there are there are scientists who have a paid day job who also make between £1,000 and £50,000 per STEM event that they do. This is a bone of contention in our community. There's no right or wrong. They're able to command it because that's what the market value is commanding. But it's a sore point with some people in the community in terms of what science communication is and engaging with you guys. Is it right that that I would ask Wyke to pay me £2,000 to come and give a talk to you guys? It doesn't feel right to me, but that's my own personal opinion. Okay, I'm going to end on the last of these questions, which is the why. Why do we actually do these sorts of things? Why is science communication important? And there's no way you're going to be able to read this. The most important thing is I've got this color-coded horizontal bar, which is how funding in UK universities, where the source of funding, between roughly about £7 billion goes into UK universities to do research. And the color, which is this little color here, whatever that is, purple color there, that reflects the amount of money which is invested from private, if you like, from business and private donations. That is 7% of the research budget in universities is private. The other 93% comes from you guys, from me paying my taxes, everyone paying their taxes. It comes from European sources. Roughly 25% of the funding now comes from European funding. The main point being that a large fraction of the research is paid by you, your parents, your teachers, by me. It's part of our taxes. And so there's a responsibility to report back on what that money is actually being used for. And again, that may not have been the same thing several thousand years ago, or if you're being funded by a private donor who isn't worried about these sorts of things. But if you're funded by government grants, whether they're national or international grants, there is a responsibility to report on what you're doing so people actually see what their money is going into. So that's probably one of the more important take-home messages for today. It's also become increasingly important just in our standard grant applications to do research. So in the US, not every grant, but most grants in the US, if you apply for a grant, you have to ring fence 10% of that grant to do outreach and engagement. Now that could be outreach and engagement with business and industry, or it could be public outreach and public engagement. But there has to be a ring-fenced amount that is invested into reporting back what you're actually doing with that money. Within the UK, we haven't tied that explicitly in a formula inside of our individual grants that we apply for, but we do get funding every 5 to 7 years as part of an excellence framework. It's called the Research Excellence Framework. And 25% of the funding that we get is kind of a block grant every 7 years. 25% of that is tied to knowledge exchange and education and public outreach. So that is another reason why, it may be a cynical reason for doing it, but the reality is 25% of our block grant every 5 to 7 years is tied to public engagement and knowledge exchange with industry. So there is a real financial reason, as well as the main reason why many of us do it is because we want to engage with you, which is going to be the next generation of people that we need in the STEM subjects, particularly here in the north of England and all across the north of England, from Preston all the way across to Hull. There's this sort of loose affiliation and philosophy moving forward called the Northern Powerhouse and the development of the Northern Powerhouse. Most of the funding within the UK is tied to what's called the Golden Triangle, which is London, Oxford, Cambridge. And that has had an impact outside of the Golden Triangle. So looking at the next 10, 20 years, you're going to see a redistribution to some degree, and the development across this thing called the Northern Powerhouse. And we need people like you to go into the STEM subject. It doesn't matter for us which STEM subject, but it's getting people who have those cross-disciplinary marketable skills, whether you're going into astrophysics, whether you're going to biology, zoology, animal science, data science, computer science. These are all the critical things that we need, particularly in the north of England. And I guess just a couple things to finish up on. One is for you guys to actually be doing your homework. If you want to supplement anything that I said, there's an enormous amount of information on www.gov.uk which talks very explicitly about the sorts of investments that are needed and why we need to be engaging with schools and with colleges and doing the sorts of events that I'm doing right now in terms of the communication side of things. These are just two things that if you have time to click on, doesn't matter which flavor of science you're going into, applied science, pure science, the sorts of skills that industry wants to see are laid out very clearly inside of there, and communication is one of them. Your ability to go to an interview and give a clear and coherent presentation in an interview, you may think of as being sort of a minor thing. You might be worried about, did I get 90% on this test, or did I get an A star or an A? But the reality is there are very, very important things which almost outweigh to some degree what your final grade classification is, and it's that ability to communicate, to work in a team, also be able to work independently, be able to take criticism. These are the things that are called the soft skills. You learn them as part of communication as a whole, but that is highlighted particularly in the top one here, the Wake and Review, which he interviewed 500 leading businesses, industry leaders around the UK, and said, that is the number one thing we need, and the thing that is lacking is people who have these well-developed soft skills, an ability to communicate, an ability to work in a team. So this is an important part that's sort of intertwined with science communication as a whole that you guys really should be thinking about as you're starting to make your decisions for what you're going to be doing over the next couple of years. And it's a big reason, like I said, for why we do what we do at the university and why we've built such a strong relationship with White. We typically have maybe a dozen interns per year coming from White to spend either term breaks with us or Easter break or during the summer. So some of you might recognize some of them, like Eve, Eloise, Katie, Georgina have all spent time over the last year working with my group. And it's about communicating the work that we do with them so that they can make a decision on what they're going to do with their career, but also more importantly is to come back and talk to you about what the research experiences that they've had. Partially, yeah, it's to try to recruit you guys to come to Hull as well, but it's more about expanding the reach of the research that we do and communicating that to the wider community and using you guys using them as a conduit to reach more of you than I can reach just through the internship scheme. And as I said at the very beginning, the big event on the horizon for us in terms of science communication, and probably the single biggest event that's broadly under science communication in the country, is the annual British Science Festival that is being held here at the university and spread throughout the city, September 11th to 14th. About 15,000 people will be in attendance. More or less any of the names that you saw mentioned previously, including people like Jocelyn Bell-Burnell and Helen Sharman, the UK's first astronaut, will all be here in attendance for the Science Festival. The official launch is April 18th, so the full program with all of the speakers will be laid out on the 18th. And there is opportunities if you guys want to be involved, and if any of you are thinking about careers in science communication, then get in touch through the Hull branch of the British Science Association. There's a Facebook page, there's a Twitter feed. You can contact us through that if you want to be involved, if you want to volunteer, if you just want to be part of what's going on at the Science Festival. And that is everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk. Does anybody have any questions for Brad? Don't be shy. You can ask. Okay. If anybody does have any questions, I can pass them on to him. So if you think of anything, we'll give you his email address so that he can send you questions. Thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime and coming to the talk.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. Just another round of applause for Brad, please. And you can go to your lesson.